She was 76 years old. Her son had changed the locks on the only house she had ever lived in. Her daughter-in-law had packed her clothes into 2 faded canvas suitcases and set them on the front porch like luggage, waiting for a stranger to claim. She had exactly $2 in her purse, one creased bill folded in half, and another rubbed thin at the corners, and her great-grandmother's gold wedding ring hanging on a thin chain beneath her sweater, worn by 68 years of being worn next to her skin. She also had a piece of paper in her coat pocket. A piece of paper her father had hidden behind the lining of a Bible she had not opened in 40 years. A piece of paper that in time would carry her 200 miles west of everything she had ever called home to a county she could not remember visiting, to a clerk's office that smelled of dust and varnish
You want
and
this
the
treat?
slow accumulation of small-town years.
Okay, here
and
you
finally
are.
to a structure rising out of the
Good
red
dog.
sandstone of the Black Mesa cliffs that no living person had laid eyes on in 62 years. Look at her now. Stand still and look. She is standing in a field of yellow-orange
I
aspen
promise I'll
leaves
come
on
back
the
for you
last
and the
warm
dog.
afternoon of
I
November.
know you will.
An old
Now
olive
go
wool
on,
barn
attachment
coat
plate.
hanging from her thin shoulders, her silver white hair tied back in the same soft knot her mother used to wear. Her breath is making little clouds in the cold mesa air. Behind her, a stone and cedar structure rises 3 stories tall against a wall of rust-red rock. Its watchtower built directly into the face of the cliff. Steam rising in slow curls from a copper pipe near the roof, as if someone had lit a fire inside that morning and walked away. Beside her left boot stands a tawny brown dog with a white blaze running straight down between his eyes. To the tip of his muzzle, his amber gaze fixed on a point in the distance only he can see. In her gloved hand, she is holding a leather ledger 3 inches thick. It's covered dark and softened by the oils of a man's fingers from 20 years of patient work in the silence of these mountains. She is not crying. She is not smiling. She is reading something on the inside cover that nobody on earth has read since the autumn of 1962. But to understand how Winifred Hartwell came to be standing alone at the end of a deerskin map, in a place her family had pretended did not exist, holding the life's work of a man her father had stopped speaking about the day he died, you have to go back. You have to go back to a Sunday morning in late October in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when she walked home from the 8 o'clock service at First Methodist on 21st Street and found that the key to her own front door no longer fit the lock. If you have ever stood on a porch that wasn't yours anymore, even when the name on the mailbox still belonged to you, stay with me. Hit the subscribe button down below this video so you don't miss what comes next. And in the comments tonight, before you forget, tell me where you're watching from. Iowa, Tennessee, Georgia, Eastern Oklahoma. I read them. Every one. Now, let's go back. The Hartwell name had been in the red dirt of the Oklahoma Panhandle longer than the state of Oklahoma had been a state. In the spring of 1887, a thin-faced man named Ezekiel Hartwell stepped off a Santa Fe freight car at a whistle stop called Boise City and walked 31 miles west across the shortgrass prairie with everything he owned in a flour sack slung over one shoulder. He was 28 years old. He had come up from Tennessee on the rumor of the Homestead Act, and he was carrying a single piece of paper signed by the General Land Office, promising him 160 acres of any unclaimed ground he could prove up on by his own labor. 5 years of work, a dwelling, a crop, that was the price. He broke that ground with a single tree plow and a borrowed mule. He cut the first cottonwood logs out of the draw at the back of his claim by himself with a cross-cut saw whose handle had been wrapped in tarred twine to keep it from splitting his palms. He built the first Hartwell cabin in the autumn of that year, a one-room log structure with a sod roof and a stone chimney that he laid himself riverstone by riverstone from the bed of the Cimarron when it ran low in October. He took a wife from a Methodist mission school in Beaver County the following spring and brought her home in a borrowed wagon. Her name was Tabitha. She bore him 6 children in that one room, and 4 of them lived to see the next century. That was the first generation. The second generation was a man named James Hartwell, the third of those 4 surviving children born in the cabin in 1885. He grew up speaking to mules before he spoke to men. By the time he was 20, he had added another 40 acres to the original homestead, by buying out a neighbor who had given up and gone back to Missouri. By 30, he had 320 acres in winter wheat and a Hereford herd that ran from the section line all the way down to the bed of the Beaver River when it had water in it. He survived the influenza of 1918. He survived the bank panic of 1921. He survived two of his own children before they reached the age of 6. And then in the spring of 1934, the sky turned the color of a bruise above his fields and stayed that color for 3 days. And James Hartwell stood on the porch of his father's old cabin with a wet bandana tied across his nose and mouth and watched the topsoil of 3 generations rise up off his wheat ground and march east toward Kansas like a column of soldiers. The Dust Bowl took half of what Ezekiel had broken with his hands. It took James's youngest son. It took his wife's lungs. It took his mortgage and most of his cattle and the patience of every banker in Cimarron County. But it did not take the Hartwell name off the deed. James paid the back taxes in 1939 with money borrowed from a cousin in Arkansas and a sale of bottomland he could not afford to lose. He buried his wife in 1941, and he handed what was left to his older son when that son came home from the war with a bronze star and a limp in his left leg. That was the 3rd generation. That son's name was Frederick Hartwell. Everyone called him Fred. He had come ashore at Normandy as a 24-year-old infantryman in June of 1944 and walked when he could walk at all the way to a village outside Aachen in the snow of that December. He came home in the autumn of 1946 carrying a German pocket knife in his coat and a quiet that his wife learned never to interrupt before breakfast. He took over what was left of the Cimarron acreage in 1947 and ran it the way his father had taught him, with no machinery he had not paid for in cash and no employees outside his own family. In 1948, his only daughter was born. They named her Winifred after Fred's mother because Fred's mother had carried him through Aachen in her prayers, and he believed it. He always believed it. That daughter was the 4th generation. That daughter is the woman standing on the porch swing this October morning in Tulsa with the church bulletin still folded in her gloved hand, her silver white hair coming loose from its combs in the wind, her faded denim blue eyes fixed on the brass deadbolt above her front door that her own son had installed 3 weeks ago and had told her smiling was for her safety. Winifred Hartwell was a small woman 5 feet 4 inches in her brown leather walking shoes. Her hair had gone white in her 40s all at once the way her mother's had, and she wore it tied back in a soft knot held by 2 thin tortoiseshell combs she had owned since 1968. Her eyes were a faded denim blue, the color of work shirts left out in the sun for a season, but the attention in them was sharp. The attention of a woman who had learned early to read a room before she stepped into it. A pale scar ran along the back of her left wrist where a barn door had caught her at 19, and her father had carried her 4 miles to a country doctor in his pickup truck. She wore a worn olive wool barn coat that had once belonged to her husband, soft as old paper from 40 years of October mornings, over a plain blue cotton dress, and brown leather shoes that knew the geography of her porch boards by feel. Beneath the cotton on a thin gold chain that had not been removed from her neck since 1972, hung her great-grandmother Tabitha's gold wedding ring. It was the only thing she had ever asked her mother for, the only thing her mother had ever given her without an argument, and the only thing she had ever made a promise about that one of her own children or her child's child would wear it next. She had not in this moment decided who that would be. She tried the key in the lock a second time. She turned it gently the way she had turned it for 48 years. The key did not turn the cylinder. The cylinder she could see now in the slant of the morning sun was a different shape than it had been on Friday afternoon when she had left for the women's prayer breakfast at the church. The brass was brighter. The pinholes were tighter. There was a small sticker on the side of the deadbolt plate with the name of a locksmith out of Broken Arrow. She stood there for some time without moving. The wind chime above the porch, a set of 7 copper tubes her husband Harlan had hung the year after they were married, turned in the breeze and made the 4-note sound that she had been listening to since 1976. Down at the road, 2 black Angus cows lifted their heads at the sound of a passing truck and went back to grazing. A red-tailed hawk called once from the top of the cottonwood at the corner of the drive. Inside the house, her old grandfather clock, which had belonged to her father's father, struck the half hour in its deep, familiar tone. She thought about the coffee pot she had set up the night before. She thought about the way she had measured the grounds for 2 cups, the way she always did, even though Harlan had been dead for 8 years, and one of those cups would sit untouched on the counter again this morning. She thought about the chair across the kitchen table where he had sat for 43 years, and where since he had been gone she had taken to laying out his Bible every morning, open to wherever he had stopped reading on the last night of his life. She thought about her wedding ring, her own, the one Harlan had given her in 1968, and how it had always been cold on her finger when she came in from the field, and how Harlan had always taken her hand between his and warmed it without saying a word. Has there ever been a chair in your house that no one sits in anymore? A coffee cup you keep washing because you can't bear to put it away? A coat on a hook that hasn't been worn in years, that you can't quite bring yourself to give to the church drive? If there has, then you already know something about Winifred Hartwell that this video has not yet told you. Sit with that for a moment. Now keep watching. The Hartwell place outside Tulsa was 240 acres of bottomland that Fred had bought in 1948 with the back pay from the Army and the money his father James had gotten for selling the last of the Cimarron acreage in the spring of that year. It was good land. It had been good land for Fred. It had been good land for Harlan. And it had been good land for Winifred, who had taken it over in her mother's name in 1985, when her father died, and who had run it with her husband through every farm crisis of the 1980s without ever once mortgaging it past the value of what it could earn in a single summer's wheat. She loved that land. She loved it the way a woman loves an old dog. She loved its uneven places. She loved the way the southwest corner held water after a hard rain and the way the cottonwoods came into leaf 2 days before the ones in town. She loved the back fence where Harlan had buried their first stillborn child in the spring of 1971 under a redbud tree he had planted that same week, and where she had taken to walking once a year on the anniversary of that loss to pull weeds from the small, flat stones she had set there. Harlan had been gone 8 years this November. He had died in the front bedroom at 3:43 in the morning of a coronary that the cardiologist in Tulsa had not seen coming, and that he himself had not complained about for one single day because he had not been a man who complained. She had not in those 8 years slept on his side of the bed. She had not put away his work boots from the boot tray in the mudroom. She had not stopped pouring the second cup of coffee. She had not stopped laying out his Bible on the kitchen table to whatever page she found it open to when she came down each morning, because some nights she would walk past it and find that the breeze from the open window had turned the page, and she could not help feeling that the breeze had carried something with it. She had not until the morning of the locks ever once felt afraid of the house. But she had felt in the last 6 months that something inside the family was beginning to bend in a direction she could not see. Her son had begun visiting more. His name was Branson Hartwell. He was 48 years old. He had been her late-life child born in 1976, after years when she had given up hope of carrying one to term, and she had loved him from his first breath in a way she had never quite been able to put into language. He had grown up on the Tulsa farm. He had ridden the tractor on his father's lap from the age of 3. He had gone to Oklahoma State for a degree in business that she had paid for in cash out of the proceeds of 2 unusually good wheat years in the late 1990s, and he had moved to Dallas afterward to work for an oil services firm she could not remember the name of. He had not in the 26 years since he had moved to Dallas ever come home for more than a long weekend. Until this past June. Now he came every other Sunday, sometimes more. He came in a new gray pickup that he parked at the far end of the gravel turnaround so that she suspected she would not see the Continental Resources tag on the back bumper. He brought his wife, a tall, thin-shouldered woman named Camille, whom Winifred had met 4 times before the wedding, and who had never in 19 years of marriage to Branson accepted an invitation to Tulsa for a holiday meal. Camille had a way of carrying a leather day planner everywhere she went and tapping it with a long, red-painted fingernail when she was thinking. She had a voice that was always 2 notes higher than the room called for, and she said the word mother in the same tone she might have used to address a clerk at the bank. They came with a man from a law firm in Oklahoma City whose name Winifred had not been able to keep track of from one visit to the next. They came with brochures from an assisted living facility in Broken Arrow with a fountain in the lobby. They came with talk of estate planning and Medicaid look-back periods and the language of protecting your assets that Winifred had been hearing in church coffee hour from other widows for a decade. They came one Sunday in early September with a stack of papers that Branson had set in front of her at her own kitchen table on a printed cover sheet titled Durable Power of Attorney. He had told her with his hand on her hand and his face close to hers, and the smile he had used as a child when he wanted something he could not have, that it was just a formality. Would you sign a paper your own child put in front of you if he told you it was only a formality? If he told you it was for tax reasons? If he told you it was so he could handle things in case anything happened? If he kissed the top of your head and said you would always be in charge? Would you sign, or would you read it first? Winifred had read it. She had read it slowly the way her father had taught her to read every document that was put in front of her in her life with her finger moving line by line. She had not signed it that day. She had told Branson she would think about it. She had said she wanted to ask Pastor Whitman the same way she asked Pastor Whitman about every important thing. Branson had not been pleased. His smile had stayed, but his eyes had not, and Camille had tapped her red fingernail twice against her planner and looked out the window at the empty corn stubble in a way that made Winifred feel for the first time in her life that she was being measured against the value of the dirt outside. She had not signed. She had that night hidden the papers in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. What she did not know on the Sunday morning in October when she walked home from the 8 o'clock service and found the brass deadbolt that did not match her key was that Branson and Camille had spent the previous Tuesday afternoon at a notary's office in Dallas with a copy of those same papers and a signature in blue ballpoint pen that very closely resembled hers but was not in any laboratory's judgment hers. She did not know that. She did not know any of it. She stood on her own porch in her husband's wool coat in the slow October sunlight and listened to the brass wind chime above her head turn through its 4 familiar notes. She tried the key one more time. The cylinder did not move. She turned around. She walked down the 3 porch steps to where her 2 canvas suitcases sat side by side on the boards she had swept clean the night before. They had been packed in a hurry. The smaller one was the one she had taken to Branson's wedding in Dallas in 2005 and had not used since. The larger one had a handle held together with a piece of duct tape that she recognized as the duct tape from the roll in the mudroom. On top of the larger suitcase in a manila envelope was an unsealed letter on the stationery of the Oklahoma City law firm whose name she could not remember. And on top of the envelope, sitting upright and catching the late morning light, were 2 things. The first was a worn leather Bible, the one her father had carried home from the war in his footlocker, the one Harlan had read every night for 31 years, the one she had not opened in 4 decades because the act of opening it felt somehow too large to do alone. The second was the gold pocket watch her father had been given by his own father on the day Fred shipped out for England in 1944, a Waltham pocket watch made in Massachusetts in 1918, engraved on the inside lid with the words, "To my son. The hours belong to you now." They had been laid out together on the suitcase deliberately like an offering, like a gesture, like the kind of small mercy a person extends to another person who is not in any other sense going to be shown mercy at all. Winifred Hartwell looked at the Bible and the pocket watch for a long time. Her face did not change. Her hand did not reach for either of them. She turned her head very slowly and looked at the long gravel drive that ran down from the porch to the section road and at the line of cottonwoods on the south fence that she had watched come into leaf for 76 consecutive springs, and at the small flat stone under the redbud where her first child slept. She walked to the porch swing on the east side of the porch. She sat down. She sat there for 32 minutes by the watch on her wrist. She did not cry. She did not cry because there was nothing in her at that moment to cry with, because the part of her that knew how to cry had been used up some years before in a different room, and she had not gotten it back. She watched a sparrow hop along the porch rail. She watched the wind move the leaves of the cottonwood at the corner of the house. At 32 minutes, she stood up. She walked into the front yard and stood beside her two suitcases, and she took the cell phone out of her coat pocket, the one her granddaughter had given her 2 Christmases ago, and had set up with a list of contacts, and she scrolled to the name she had not, in 8 years of widowhood, ever once allowed herself to lean on. The name was Marlo. Marlo Hartwell was 21 years old. She was Branson's only child by his first wife, a woman who had died of breast cancer in 2009 when Marlo was 6, and Branson had been on the road in West Texas and had not, by Camille's quiet later admission, made it home in time for the last evening. Marlo had grown up between her grandparents' farm in Tulsa and a stepmother who had never quite warmed to her, and she had taken up residence in her grandmother's life the way certain children take up residence in the lives of certain old women, quietly and forever. She was finishing her 3rd year of law school at the University of Tulsa. She was the only person in the family, including Winifred's own son, whom Winifred trusted with the password to her checking account. Winifred dialed. Marlo answered on the second ring. "Grandma." "Sweetheart." "What's wrong?" "I need you to come and get me." There was a small, careful silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that a young person makes when she has been preparing without knowing it for a phone call of this exact shape for some time. "Where are you?" "I'm at the house." "Why are you at the house and not in the house?" "Because the locks have been changed." There was another silence. "I'm coming," Marlo said. "There's no hurry, baby." "I'm coming." The line went dead. Winifred sat down on her larger suitcase. She placed her purse on her lap. She rested her hand on her great-grandmother's gold wedding ring through the thin fabric of her cotton dress. She watched the gravel road for the sound of her granddaughter's old blue Toyota. 2 miles of country road takes about 3 minutes when you're hurrying. Marlo was 38 minutes away. The first 10 of those minutes passed in the silence of a wind that smelled like burning leaves from somewhere off to the west. The 11th minute, Winifred saw something move in the tall grass on the far side of the section road. She did not stand up. She watched. What came out of the grass first was a nose, a dark, alert nose at the end of a narrow muzzle. The nose lifted into the air, scented the wind, and dropped. Then the rest of the dog followed slowly, the way an animal moves when it is not sure whether it is welcome anywhere on the face of the earth. He was a medium-sized dog, lean and ribbed under his coat, the muscles of his shoulders standing up in low ridges from the kind of life that asks an animal to walk farther than he eats. His coat was a warm, tawny brown across the flanks, with a darker, almost black saddle running from his shoulder blades down the slope of his back, down the center of his forehead, straight between his eyes, and down the bridge of his muzzle to the very tip of his nose ran a single clean stripe of white, ablaze the color of fresh milk, perfect as if it had been painted by a careful hand. His right ear stood straight up, alert and quick to turn, and at the top edge of it was a small V-shaped notch from some old healed injury. His left ear folded forward at the tip like a page that had been turned down. His eyes were a warm amber brown, intelligent and steady. Around his neck was a thin red nylon collar, faded almost pink by the sun with no tag at all. He stopped in the middle of the section road and looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them moved for what felt to her in that moment like a long time. It was probably 20 seconds. The dog took one step forward, then another. He came across the gravel of the road and into the grass at the base of the mailbox, and he stopped there again with about 10 feet between them, and he sat down. He sat down the way a dog sits down when he has been on his feet for days and is not entirely sure he has permission to stop. Winifred reached into her purse very slowly and pulled out the small Tupperware container of saltine crackers and cheddar cheese cubes that she had been bringing to the church coffee hour the same way she had brought them every other Sunday for 30 years. She removed the lid. She held out a cube of cheese in her palm. The dog did not move. She set the cheese down on the gravel 6 feet from her and pulled her hand back. The dog watched her hand all the way back to her lap. Then he stood up, came forward, took the cheese with the gentleness of an animal who has been hit for taking things that did not belong to him, and went back to where he had been sitting. He sat down again. He looked at her. She set down another cube. The 8th time she did this, he came forward and took the cheese and did not back away. He sat down at her feet. He did not lean against her. He did not nuzzle her hand. He simply sat there with his weight angled toward her left boot, the way a creature angles itself toward warmth. She let her hand fall palm up to her lap. She did not reach for him. After some minutes, he laid his chin very lightly across the toe of her boot. She closed her eyes. She opened them. She said in a voice so quiet it would not have carried as far as the mailbox, "I don't know where I'm going either." The dog did not move. She said, "But you might as well come." The dog opened his amber eyes. He looked up at her. The small V-shaped notch in his right ear caught the late morning sun. She thought of a word her father had used when she was a child for any kindness that arrived without being asked for. He had used it for the rain that had come the spring of 1953 and saved their wheat. He had used it for the doctor who had crossed 2 counties in a blizzard to set her wrist when she had been 19. He had used it for her mother coming home from the hospital after a surgery they had not believed she would survive. The word was boon, an unexpected gift, a grace given when one had not been asked for. She said it out loud. Boon. The dog tilted his head 1 inch to the side. The small white blaze on his forehead in the sunlight looked very nearly bright. "That's your name now," she said, "if you'll have it." The dog laid his chin back across the toe of her boot. She let her hand fall finally to the soft place on the top of his head between the standing right ear with its V-notch in the folded down left ear. She rested her hand there. She did not cry then. But something inside her, which had been holding very still for 32 minutes on a porch swing, and for 8 years before that, let go just enough to allow her to breathe. The blue Toyota came up the section road 11 minutes later. Marlo Hartwell parked at the end of the drive and came across the grass at a half run, her brown ponytail swinging behind her, and stopped 6 feet short of the mailbox when she saw the dog sitting at her grandmother's feet with his chin on her boot. "Grandma. His name is Boone. Is he yours?" "He is as of about 20 minutes ago." Marlo looked at the dog looked at Marlo. Then the dog turned his head slowly and laid his chin back down on Winifred's boot as if he had decided something. "All right," Marlo said. She walked over and picked up the smaller suitcase. She came back and picked up the larger one. She did not, Winifred noticed, look at the Bible and the pocket watch laid out on top of it, because Marlo had already understood from the moment her grandmother had said the words, "The locks have been changed," exactly what those 2 objects on top of a suitcase were meant to say, and exactly what they were meant not to say. Marlo carried both suitcases to the Toyota and set them in the back. She came back for her grandmother. Winifred stood up. She picked up the Bible from the top of the porch boards. She did not pick up the pocket watch. She left the pocket watch sitting there in the sun on the canvas of a suitcase she would never carry again, because the watch had belonged to her father, and her father had told her at the end of his life that the hours belonged to her now, and she would not on this morning accept a thing that had already been hers in the language of a hand that had locked her out. She walked down the porch steps for the last time as the legal occupant of the only house she had ever lived in. She walked across the grass toward her granddaughter's Toyota with her great-grandmother's gold wedding ring against her chest beneath the cotton of her dress, and her husband's wool coat across her shoulders, and her father's Bible in the crook of her arm. The dog Boone walked beside her left boot, the white blaze on his muzzle bright in the sun, the small V-notch in his right ear turned toward whatever sound the wind was making out beyond the cottonwoods at the corner of the drive. She did not look back at the house. She did not need to. The house knew her and she knew it, and there would be other mornings in another country to think about what had passed between them in this one. Marlowe held the passenger door of the Toyota open. Boone jumped into the back seat without being asked, settled himself, and put his chin on the armrest beside Winifred's shoulder. Marlowe started the engine. They pulled out onto the section road. In the rearview mirror, the white farmhouse of the Hartwell place got smaller and smaller against the cottonwoods, and the brass wind chime that Harlan had hung in 1976 turned in the breeze without anyone left on the porch to hear it. 68 years she had lived on that land. She left it with a Bible, a great-grandmother's ring, a stray dog, and 2 creased dollar bills in the purse on her lap. She did not yet know about the piece of paper that had been folded behind the leather lining of the Bible since her father had hidden it there in 1985. She did not yet know that her son had not in fact locked her out of her own home in order to put her in an assisted living facility. She did not yet know about Continental Resources or about a survey done in secret across 2 summers in the Oklahoma Panhandle, or about a man named Thatcher Croft, whose grandfather had once paid another man to make a problem disappear in 1962. She did not yet know that a woman named Mabel Ainsworth, in a clerk's office 200 miles to the west, had been keeping a sealed wooden box on the top shelf of a records vault for almost 4 years, waiting for someone with the right name to walk through her door. She did not yet know that the cabin she would eventually buy for $2 was only the first of 3. And she did not yet know, would not know for some weeks yet, that an 8-year-old girl in a photograph from 1955 had been standing all this time on a sandstone porch beside a man whose name her father had refused to say at the dinner table, and that the girl in that photograph was herself, and that the man beside her had written underneath the picture in pencil in the careful slanted hand of a surveyor the words Winifred, the girl with the quiet eyes. She'll come back someday. They always do. All of that was ahead of her on a section road in Tulsa County on a Sunday morning in late October, in the cab of a 20-year-old Toyota driven by her 21-year-old granddaughter. What she had in that moment was the wool coat across her shoulders and the gold ring against her chest, and the warm weight of a stray dog's chin on the armrest beside her, and the steady amber eye of a creature who, like herself, had been let go by the world and had decided against all reason to walk the next stretch of road in company. It was, she would later think, the beginning of everything. She did not know that yet either, but it was. 3 weeks passed in the upstairs apartment of a 2-story brick building on Cherry Street in Tulsa, 6 blocks from the law school. Marlowe Hartwell lived in the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. She gave the larger one to her grandmother without being asked and without making a ceremony of it. She moved her clothes in 2 trips down the hall in laundry baskets. She set up a folding cot for herself in the corner of the smaller room, and she did not in 3 weeks once mention that she had given up her own bed. Winifred slept the first night with the great-grandmother's gold ring still on his chain beneath her cotton nightgown, the way she had slept every night for 53 years, and with her father's leather Bible on the nightstand beside her. The dog Boone slept on the floor at the foot of the bed, the white blaze on his muzzle turned toward the bedroom door, the small V-notch in his right ear catching the streetlight that came in around the edge of the blind. She did not in those 3 weeks become a burden. This is important to understand about Winifred Hartwell. She had been raised by a man who had come home from Aiken carrying a silence his family had learned to move around, and by a woman who had been the youngest of 9 children in a Methodist parsonage in eastern Tennessee, and she had been taught by both of them that the worst thing a person could do when she had been taken in by a kindness was to act as if the kindness was owed. So she rose before Marlowe each morning. She made coffee. She made oatmeal with brown sugar and a slice of orange on the side. She walked Boone along Cherry Street at 6 o'clock when the city was still cold and quiet, and she came back and folded the laundry that Marlowe had not had time to fold, and she sat with her father's Bible open on the small table by the window and read 3 chapters before her granddaughter came out of the smaller bedroom in a sweatshirt with the words Tulsa Law across the chest and a textbook already open in her hand. In the afternoons, Marlowe worked. She worked at the dining table that they had moved against the wall to make room for the cot. She worked with a laptop and a yellow legal pad and a stack of property law textbooks. She had told her grandmother on the drive home from the farm that first Sunday that she wanted to look into a few things. She had said it lightly, the way a person says lightly the things she has been thinking about most. What Marlo was looking into in those 3 weeks was every document with a Hartwell name on it that had ever been filed in the state of Oklahoma. She started with the obvious. She pulled the deed for the Tulsa farm. She pulled the warranty deed Fred had signed in 1948. She pulled the transfer to Winifred and Harlan in 1985 and the transfer to Winifred alone in 2016 after Harlan's death. The chain of title was clean. There was no lien against the property. There was no lien against the property. There was no foreclosure notice. There was in the Tulsa County Clerk's online records no power of attorney filed in Winifred's name at all. Marlo noted this down on her yellow pad and underlined it twice. On the morning of the 8th day, she found something else. She found a recorded power of attorney filed not in Tulsa County, but in Dallas County, Texas, on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. It was a durable power of attorney granting Branson Hartwell the authority to act on his mother's behalf in all matters financial, real estate, medical, and probate. It had been notarized by a notary public whose seal was registered to a UPS store on a service road in North Dallas. The signature on the document was Winifred's name in blue ballpoint pen. Marlo printed the signature page. She walked into the kitchen and laid it on the counter beside her grandmother's coffee cup. "Grandma, did you sign this?" Winifred looked at it for a long time. She picked up her reading glasses from the table. She put them on. She looked again. "No," she said. "You're sure?" "I have been signing my own name for 68 years, sweetheart. I know my W." The W on the document was not her W. The W on the document was a tall, narrow-pointed letter. Winifred's W had always been a soft, round letter with a small curl at the top left, the way her mother had taught her to make it in the 3rd grade in 1956, with a copybook from the Oklahoma State Department of Public Instruction. The W on the document had been written by someone else. Marlo set the page down. She put her hand on her grandmother's hand. "That is a felony," she said, "in every state in the Union, and we are going to do something about it." "All right, baby. But first, I have to understand something." "What?" "I have to understand why." That was the question that drove Marlo Hartwell in the days that followed into the deeper records of the Oklahoma State Archives and into a digitized collection of homestead patents at the National Archives website in College Park, Maryland, and finally into the property records of a county on the other end of the state that her grandmother had never spoken about and had not, to Marlo's knowledge, ever once visited. Cimarron County, Oklahoma, the far western tip of the Panhandle, 207 miles by the shortest road from the apartment on Cherry Street. The first hit was a 1887 homestead patent issued to a man named Ezekiel Hartwell the Elder. 160 acres, filed in Boise City, Cimarron County, proved up in 1892. Marlo read the patent twice. She pulled up the original handwritten land office records. She traced the chain of ownership through 3 generations. The Cimarron acreage, as best she could tell, had been sold by James Hartwell in 1948 to a cattle company out of Liberal, Kansas. The recorded price had been $3,700. The sale had been registered with the Cimarron County Clerk in the spring of that year. Fred had been 28 years old. Fred had used that money along with his Army back pay to buy the Tulsa bottomland. That was what the family had always known. That was the story Winifred had grown up with, that her grandfather James, broken by the Dust Bowl, and his wife's lungs, and the war that had taken so much, had sold the original Hartwell ground in 1948 and brought the family east to start over. It was a story Winifred's mother had told her in a tone that did not invite questions. But there was something Marlo found on the evening of the 11th day that did not fit the story. She was looking on a hunch at the 1962 records of Cimarron County, not the 1948 records, the 1962 records 14 years after the sale. What she found filed on the 17th of September of that year was a quit-claim deed. The quitclaim deed transferred a parcel of land described as the original Hartwell homestead and all improvements thereon, comprising 160 acres. Section 14 Township 3 North Range, 6 east of the Cimarron Meridian, from a man named Ezekiel Hartwell, the younger, to a man named Cyrus Croft. The deed had been signed by Ezekiel Hartwell the younger on the morning of September 17, 1962. Ezekiel Hartwell the younger had been declared missing by the Cimarron County Sheriff's Department on the evening of September 18, 1962. He had never been found. Marlo sat back in her chair. She read the dates 3 times. She got up and walked to the window and looked down at Cherry Street, where the late November light was already going thin, and then she walked into the kitchen where her grandmother was sitting at the table with Boone's chin on her knee, the dog's white blaze pale in the kitchen lamp. "Grandma." "Yes, baby." "Did your father have a brother?" Winifred's hand, which had been resting on the dog's head, went very still. She did not answer for some time. When she did, her voice was different. It was lower and it was further away, and it sounded like she was speaking from a room down the hall. "He did," she said. "His name was Ezekiel. He was 4 years older than my father. He died in 1962. "How did he die?" "They said he went into the country west of Boise City to do some surveying work and didn't come out." Surveying. He was a surveyor. He had trained at Oklahoma A&M before the war. He didn't go to the war. He had a heart condition. He was the only one of the Hartwell men in 3 generations who didn't go to war. My father was ashamed of him for it, I think, or jealous of him. I never could tell which." "What happened to his body?" "They never found a body, baby. They found his truck. They found his hat. They didn't find him." "And the land?" "What land?" "His land, Grandma. He owned the original homestead, the Cimarron ground." Winifred looked at her granddaughter slowly. Her faded denim blue eyes did not blink. The pale scar on the back of her left wrist caught the lamplight. "No, sweetheart. My grandfather, James, sold the Cimarron ground in 1948. My father bought the Tulsa place with the proceeds. That was the family story. That was always the story. It wasn't sold in 1948, Grandma, or rather, part of it was, but your great-uncle Ezekiel kept 1/4 section. He kept the original homestead, and he held it until September of 1962. "That can't be." "It is. My father never spoke of any such thing." "Your father may have had reasons not to." Winifred sat for a long time without moving. The dog, Boone, sensing the change in her, lifted his head from her knee and pressed it more firmly into the crook of her hand. She did not look down at him. She did not move her hand. She was looking at the small kitchen window above the sink and the bare branches of a hackberry tree on the other side of it, and at a place much further away than that. "Marlo." "Yes." "Bring me that Bible." It was the leather Bible from her father's footlocker. It was the Bible Camille had laid out on top of the suitcase. It was the only thing Winifred had taken from the porch. Marlo brought it from the bedside table. Winifred opened it on the kitchen table. She turned the pages slowly, the way a woman turns the pages of a book she has been postponing reading for 40 years. She turned to the place where Fred had kept his bookmarks and his sermon notes and the small loose pages of his life. She felt along the inside of the back cover where the leather lining had pulled away from the board at the corner. Her fingers stopped. She slid them in. She pulled out a single folded piece of paper, the size of a check, brittle and yellowed at the edges from 40 years of being pressed between leather and pasteboard. She unfolded it on the kitchen table. It was a note written in pencil in a careful, slanted hand that Winifred did not at first recognize. The letters were small. They had been written quickly. They had been written, she would later think, on the dashboard of a truck. "Fred cabin still standing. Map under the hearth. Don't tell Jay." E.H. Winifred read it twice. She put her hand over her mouth. "That is my great-uncle Ezekiel's hand," she said. "I have not seen it since I was a small girl, but that is his hand. He used to write me birthday cards. He used to write them in pencil like that." "When do you think he wrote this?" "I do not know, But my father hid it in here, and my father did not hide things in his Bible without a reason. Marlowe lifted the note carefully and held it up to the lamp. Grandma, he says the cabin is still standing. He says there's a map under the hearth. He's telling your father about something. He's telling your father about something he didn't want your grandfather to know about. Don't tell J. James, my grandfather. Yes. My grandfather sold the Cimarron ground in 1948. Or so he said, or so my father said. But this, Winifred tapped the note very gently with one fingertip. This was written some time later, because the cabin was still standing, and my great-uncle Ezekiel did not die until 1962. Grandma. Yes. I think your great-uncle didn't die. I think your great-uncle was killed. Winifred did not speak. The dog Boone laid his chin back across her foot under the table. If your family had lost something 100 years ago, would you go looking for it? If your father had hidden a piece of paper in a Bible to keep it safe, and you had been raised on a story that turned out not to be the whole story, and a granddaughter you trusted with your checking account told you she thought your blood had been taken from you by someone with a name you had grown up hearing, would you stay where you were, or would you get in the car? That night, Winifred Hartwell did not sleep. She sat in the small reading chair by the window with her father's Bible across her lap and Boone at her feet, and she watched the light from Cherry Street move across the wallpaper in slow squares, and she thought about a man she barely remembered. A thin man in a brown work coat with the same faded blue Hartwell eyes she saw every morning in the mirror, who had picked her up once at a gas station outside Guyman when she was a child and had carried her on his hip into a roadside diner and had bought her a chocolate malted with the last quarter in his pocket. She thought about how that man had bent down and whispered something into her ear at the door of her father's truck before she left him. She could not remember what he had said. She could only remember that he had said something, and that the smell of his coat had been pine and tobacco, and that his eyes had been very steady. In the morning, she came out of the bedroom dressed in a clean blue dress and the olive wool barn coat. The Bible was in the canvas bag at her side. The great-grandmother's gold ring was on its chain beneath her dress. Marlowe was already at the table with her laptop open and 2 cups of coffee poured. Grandma, I want you to take me to Cimarron County. Marlowe nodded. She closed the laptop. She had already, Winifred saw, packed an overnight bag of her own and set it by the door. I figured. They were on Highway 412 West by 10 o'clock. The drive from Tulsa to Boise City is 6.5 hours if you do not stop, and 7.5 if you stop, which Marlowe and Winifred did twice, once at a Love's truck stop east of Woodward for gas and a chicken sandwich, and once at a roadside picnic table outside Guyman, where Boone got out and walked along a barbed wire fence for 15 minutes with his nose to the ground, as if he had been here before, which was not possible, and yet was the impression he gave. The country opened as they drove. This is something a person who has not driven across the Oklahoma Panhandle does not understand. The country opens. The sky, which had been a normal Tulsa sky in the morning, became something else by the time they passed Woodward. By the time they crossed the line into Beaver County in the afternoon, the horizon was further away than Winifred had ever seen a horizon be in her own state. The grass was short, in the color of old gold. The wind moved through it in long, flat ripples that looked like water. There were no trees except along the creek beds, and there were not many creek beds. Every 20 miles there was a town, and most of the towns were 3 streets long and going the color of the grass. Winifred sat in the passenger seat and watched. She did not speak for the better part of an hour. When she did speak, it was to say very quietly, "This is the country my great-grandfather walked into in 1887 with everything he owned in a flour sack." Yes, ma'am. It does not look like a place a person would walk into. No, ma'am. And yet he did. He did. They were quiet for another 20 miles. Then Winifred said, "Marlowe." Yes. What happens if we find that he was killed? Then we find out who killed him, and we find out who has been holding what was his, and we take it back. It has been 62 years. The law does not have a calendar, Grandma. Title is title, and fraud is fraud, and murder does not expire. You sound like a lawyer. I am almost a lawyer. You sound like a Hartwell. That too. The dog Boone in the back seat lifted his head briefly at the sound of his family's name and laid it back down on the armrest. They came into Boise City a little after 4 in the afternoon. Boise City, Oklahoma is the county seat of Cimarron County. It has on a generous afternoon 1,200 residents. The courthouse sits on a square in the middle of town and was built in 1925 of red sandstone quarried from the Mesa country to the north. The square has 4 streets and a small park with a flagpole and a granite marker commemorating the only place in the contiguous United States that was bombed by American aircraft during the Second World War, which happened by accident in 1943 when a training crew out of Dalhart, Texas lost its bearings. Marlowe parked the Toyota in front of the courthouse. She and Winifred and Boone climbed the 7 steps to the front door. The county clerk's office was on the first floor 2 doors down from the main hallway, behind a frosted glass window with the words County Clerk painted on it in black serif lettering. The door was open. The room beyond the door was small and warm and smelled of varnished oak and old paper and a faint, comfortable trace of cinnamon, which turned out to be a candle on a windowsill. Behind the long wooden counter, sorting a stack of recorded deeds with a pair of half-moon reading glasses pushed up into her short gray hair, stood a woman in her late 60s in a navy cardigan and a string of small freshwater pearls. She looked up when they came in. She looked at Winifred for what felt like a long time. She looked at the dog Boone. She looked at Marlowe. She set down her stack of deeds very carefully and removed the reading glasses from her hair and folded them in her hand. "Good afternoon, ladies." "Good afternoon. What can I do for you?" Winifred stepped up to the counter. She set her purse on the polished oak. She rested her gloved hand on top of the purse. "My name is Winifred Hartwell," she said. "I am looking for the records of a property that was once owned in this county by a man named Ezekiel Hartwell. He was my great-uncle." The woman behind the counter did not move. She did not move for some seconds. Then she set her reading glasses down on the wood with a small, precise click, and she said, "Mrs. Hartwell, my name is Mabel Ainsworth. I have been the elected clerk of this county for 26 years, and I have been waiting for somebody with your last name to walk through that door for going on 4 years." Winifred said nothing. Mabel Ainsworth took a breath and let it out slowly. "My great-aunt Esther passed away in March of 2020, she said. She was 84 years old. She had been the postmistress of Boise City from 1958 until her retirement in 1996, and she had been engaged to be married to your great-uncle, Ezekiel Hartwell, in the spring of 1962. The wedding was set for the second weekend in October. He disappeared on the 18th of September. My great-aunt never married. She lived in the same house on Pine Street for 61 more years. And in the last week of her life, she sat up in bed and asked me to bring her a wooden box from the top shelf of her bedroom closet. She gave me that box, and she said to me very clearly, 'If a Hartwell ever comes back to Boise City asking about Ezekiel, give them this. Do not open it. It is not yours, and it is not mine.'" Mabel Ainsworth looked at Winifred. "I have not opened it," she said. "It has been sitting on the top shelf of the records vault in this office for 3 years and 7 months. I look at it every morning when I come into work. And I have been waiting." Winifred placed her gloved hand flat on the oak counter. The great-grandmother's gold ring lay warm beneath her cotton dress against her sternum, the way it had lain for 53 years. She said, "Then I think today is the day." Mabel Ainsworth nodded once. She turned and walked into the back of the office, and she came back 2 minutes later carrying a small wooden box about the size of a family Bible walnut, with a brass hasp and a circle of red sealing wax across the seam where the lid met the body. The wax had a small impression in it that looked in the office light like a star with 5 points, The kind of seal a Methodist parsonage in eastern Tennessee might have used in the 1930s. She set the box on the counter between them. She did not open it. Winifred looked at the box. She looked at Mabel Ainsworth. She looked at Marlowe. She said, "Is there a property in this county that is for sale by the county for back taxes or for any other reason?" Mabel Ainsworth, who had clearly expected this question, said, "There is one. Yes, ma'am." "Tell me about it." "It is a quarter section in Section 14, Township 3 North, Range 6 East. The original Hartwell homestead. The dwelling on it is a log cabin built by Ezekiel Hartwell the Elder in 1887. The cabin has not been entered to the best of this office's knowledge since September of 1962. The property reverted to the county in 1973 for back taxes after 11 years of non-payment. It has been on the books as a tax-deeded parcel for 51 years. The asking price by statute is the cost of the most recent year's recording fee. And that price is $2, Mrs. Hartwell." Winifred opened the small leather coin purse inside her larger handbag. She removed 2 crumpled $1 bills, the same 2 she had stood with on her own porch 6 weeks before, and she smoothed them flat on the polished oak counter. She slid them across. Mabel Ainsworth looked down at the $2. She looked up at Winifred Hartwell. "The land remembers its own," she said. She picked up the bills and she walked them with a small reverence to the cash drawer at the back of the room. Winifred and Marlowe were back on the highway by 5 o'clock with the deed to the quarter section folded inside the canvas bag at Winifred's feet and the small walnut box with its red wax seal on the seat between them, and Boone settled across the back with his white blaze muzzle on the armrest. The wooden box by Winifred's quiet instruction would not be opened until they were on Hartwell ground. That was the rule she set, and that was the rule Marlowe respected, and that was the rule the box itself seemed to consent to. The directions Mabel Ainsworth had written out for them on a piece of office stationery took them 8 miles north of town on the state highway, and then west on a county road that turned after the first mile into red dirt with cattle grates every quarter mile. The country went up gently. There were no trees. The sky was the largest sky Winifred had ever seen in her life. The sun was going down off to the left and the shadows were getting long, and the wind was pushing a tumbleweed across the road every minute or so. Marlowe slowed for the last cattle grate. They came over a low rise, and there in a small dish of land below them, with one cottonwood that had no business being there because there was no creek, stood a log cabin with a sagging tin roof and a stone chimney still standing straight against the western sky. Winifred put her hand to her mouth. She did not say anything. She had never seen this cabin in her conscious memory, but the cabin somehow knew her. She would think about that later and she would not be able to explain it. She would only know that the cabin sat in the dish of land, the way a familiar hat sits on the right shelf, and that the cottonwood at its corner moved in the wind, the way her father's hand had moved on the steering wheel of his truck when he had been driving her home from somewhere as a small girl. She would only know that her chest, which had been holding something tight since the morning of the locks, eased one small notch. Marlowe stopped the Toyota. They got out. Boone got out and stood with his white blaze pointed at the cabin, his right ear standing alert with its small V-notch, his left ear folded down. The wind moved the brown grass. Somewhere far off, a hawk called. Winifred walked toward the cabin in her olive wool barn coat and her brown leather shoes, with the silver-white knot of her hair coming loose at the back, and the pale scar on the back of her left wrist catching the last of the sun, and her great-grandmother's gold ring warm against her chest, and her hand after 100 steps finding the iron latch of a door that her great-uncle Ezekiel Hartwell had pulled shut for the last time on a Tuesday morning in September of 1962. She lifted the latch. The door opened on dry leather hinges. She stepped inside. Behind her, the small walnut box with the red wax seal sat on the Toyota's back seat, waiting. That night, they would clean a corner of the cabin enough to sit in. That night, they would build a fire in the stone fireplace for the first time in 62 years. That night, Marlowe would step outside to make a phone call to her own father, Branson Hartwell, and tell him that his mother was safe and would not be returning to Tulsa and would be filing for the rescission of a fraudulent power of attorney within the week, And Branson Hartwell, on the other end of the call, would be silent for 13 seconds before he said in a tone Marlo had never heard from her father before, "Where are you?" And Marlo would not tell him. And Marlo would hang up. And 10 minutes after she hung up, a gray pickup truck would slow twice on the county road a quarter mile from the cabin with its lights off before driving on. And the dog Boone would stand at the cabin door with the hair on his shoulders raised in a low ridge, and he would not bark, and he would not move. And the white blaze on his muzzle would point at the road for 40 straight minutes after the truck had gone. And in the cabin by firelight, Winifred Hartwell would lift a loose hearthstone, the third stone in from the left of the firebox, slightly paler in mortar than the others, the way her great-uncle Ezekiel had laid it on the morning of the 17th of September, 1962. Because he had known somehow that he was not coming back and she would find what he had left for her. But that comes next. What you need to know before then is that the woman who walked into that cabin at sundown on the 6th of November in the year 2024 was not the same woman who had walked off her porch in Tulsa 6 weeks earlier in her husband's wool coat with $2 in her purse and a stray dog at her boot. She was by then a Hartwell who had come home. She did not yet know what it would cost her to stay. But she knew by the steady weight of a sealed wooden box on a back seat and by the white blaze face of a dog who had refused to leave her side since a mailbox in Tulsa County, and by the careful pencil hand of a man dead 62 years who had once whispered something to her at the door of her father's truck that she was going to find out. The fire took a long time to catch. The flue had not been open in 62 years, and the first match Marlo struck went out before it reached the kindling, and the second one filled the cabin with a slow drift of smoke that Boone sneezed at twice and then walked away from with his shoulders low. But on the third try, the cottonwood splinters caught, and the dry cedar shavings beneath them caught, and the small round of split pine on top of them caught, and the light in the cabin changed. It changed the way light changes a room that has not been lit for a long time. The walls, which had been the color of mouse fur in the gray of the late afternoon, came back to themselves. The log timbers hand-hewn by Ezekiel Hartwell, the elder, in 1887, took on the warm brown they had been when Ezekiel the younger had last seen them, and the white chinking between the logs glowed almost honey-colored, and the stone of the chimney pulled the heat into itself and began very slowly to give it back. Winifred sat on the three-legged stool Marlo had wiped clean for her with a rag from the trunk of the Toyota. Boone lay across her feet. The walnut box from Mabel Ainsworth's office sat on the small plank table in front of her, with the red wax seal unbroken and the brass hasp closed. Marlo came in from outside with another armload of deadfall cottonwood. "Grandma?" "Yes. I'm going to step out and call Dad." Winifred looked up. Her faded denim blue eyes held Marlo's for a long moment. The pale scar on the back of her left wrist caught the firelight. "Tell him I am safe." "Yes, ma'am." "Tell him nothing else." "No, ma'am." Marlo stepped back out into the dusk and the wind. Winifred could hear her boots on the porch boards, and then on the gravel, and then nothing. Winifred sat by the fire with the walnut box in front of her. She did not open it. She watched the fire instead the way her father had taught her to watch a fire when she was a girl, with her hands flat on her knees and her breath slowing. She thought about a man she barely remembered in a brown work coat who had bent down and whispered something into her ear at the door of her father's pickup truck at a gas station outside Guyman when she was a child, and whose face she had never quite been able to bring back, although the smell of his coat she could still summon if she closed her eyes. Pine and tobacco and the faint, sharp odor of India ink. She thought about her father who had hidden a note in his Bible for 40 years and had never in all those years spoken his brother's name out loud at the dinner table. She broke the red wax with her thumbnail. The seal cracked clean. She lifted the brass hasp. She opened the lid of the box. Inside, on a folded square of unbleached cotton, lay three things. The first was a small leather-bound journal no larger than the palm of her hand, with the initials E.H. burned into the front cover with the tip of a heated awl. The second was an envelope addressed in pencil in the same careful slanted hand as the note in her father's Bible to Miss Esther Ainsworth, General Delivery, Boise City, Oklahoma. The third was a single photograph, sepia-toned and curled at the corners of a young man in a brown work coat and a young woman in a print dress standing in front of the cabin Winifred was sitting in. They were holding hands. The young woman had her head tilted toward the young man's shoulder. They were not quite smiling. They looked, Winifred thought, like two people who had been told they had until the end of the month to get used to being happy. She lifted the photograph out of the box. On the back in pencil, Esther and Ezekiel. April 1962. The wedding is in October if the Lord allows. She turned the photograph in her hand. She set it down carefully on the table. She lifted the envelope. It was sealed. The seal had been the kind a man makes by licking a stamp's worth of glue along the flap and pressing it down with the side of his thumb. She slid her finger under it. It came open after 62 years with a small dry rasp. The letter inside was 2 pages on lined notepad paper that had yellowed to the color of weak tea. Esther, if you are reading this, then what I have been afraid of has come true, and you must forgive me for asking you to be brave one more time when I am no longer here to ask it in person. The Croft family in Boise City did not get their land the way the courthouse records say they did. The original border survey of 1863 that put the line 10 miles east of where it ought to have been was paid for by Cyrus Croft's father with a sum of $40 in silver coin and a Winchester rifle given to a deputy surveyor named McNair in a hotel room in Trinidad, Colorado. I have the original field notes McNair kept on his own time. They are not in this box. They are in a place that the map in my journal will lead a careful reader to find. The land that ought to have come to my grandfather Ezekiel the Elder when he filed his 1887 homestead patent, the 4,800 acres between Section 14 and the Black Mesa to the north, was outside his claim only because of that fraudulent 1863 survey. The Croft family had already been grazing it for 24 years by the time my grandfather arrived in this county, and the land office in Guymon had it on the books as Croft Holdings. My grandfather went to his grave never knowing he had a claim to it. I found the truth only because I went to Trinidad. That land is now held by Cyrus Croft and his son, but it was never theirs. If I am gone, it is because I have been to Trinidad and have found the McNair notes, and I am bringing them home, and I have been seen by the wrong people. Esther, my love, do not look for me. Do not let your kindness be the thing that makes them turn to you. Keep this letter. Keep this journal. If a Hartwell ever comes home to Cimarron County asking the right questions, give it to them. They will know what to do with it. The land remembers us. We do not need to be remembered by anyone else. Yours in this world and the next, Ezekiel. Winifred read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the table very gently beside the photograph, and she put her hand over her mouth in the part of her that had not cried on the porch in Tulsa 6 weeks before, and that had not cried in the Toyota, and that had not cried in Mabel Ainsworth's office. That part of her cried now silently for the man whose hand had touched her hair at a gas station outside Guymon in 1955, and whose name her father had not been able to say out loud for the rest of his life. The dog Boone lifted his head from her feet. He laid his white blazed muzzle against her knee. She put her hand on the top of his head between the standing right ear with its V-notch and the folded down left ear, and she stayed that way for some minutes. Outside on the porch, Board's Marlowe's footsteps came back. Winifred wiped her face with the back of her hand. She put the letter back into the envelope and the envelope into the box, and she set the small leather journal in her lap. She did not open it yet. She wanted to wait for her granddaughter. Marlowe came in. She set the phone on the table. "It went the way you thought it would," Winifred said. He was quiet for 13 seconds before he answered. "I counted. He asked me where we were. I told him I was not going to tell him. He said, 'Marlowe, I need to know where my mother is.' I said she is safe, and that is the only thing you need to know." I hung up. "Did he call back?" "He called back twice. I did not answer." "Marlowe." "Yes, ma'am." "Your father is going to come looking for us." "Yes, ma'am." "And he is not going to come alone." "No, ma'am." Marlowe sat down on the floor beside Boone. The dog laid his chin across her knee without lifting his head from the boot it was already resting on, so that he was now connected by chin and shoulder to both of the women he had decided to walk this stretch of road with. Winifred opened the small leather journal in her lap. The first page was a date September 10th, 1962. The second page was a careful pencil drawing of a topographic map of Section 14 and the adjacent sections with elevations marked in a hand so precise it looked nearly printed. The third page was a list of stone outcroppings, springs, and game trails between the original homestead and a place identified in the surveyor's hand as the second cabin, West Draw, under the rim of Black Mesa. Winifred turned the page slowly. The fourth page was a drawing of the second cabin, stone foundation, log walls, tin roof. Beside it was written in the same hand, built by E.H. the Younger, 1948 to 1953. Uses relay. Map continues from hearth. Marlowe came up onto the stool beside her grandmother. She did not speak. She put her hand on her grandmother's hand, and she turned the next page of the journal with her own free hand. A larger map. Trails draw springs. A line of red ink drawn carefully across the topography ran from the second cabin north and west, climbing into the foothills of Black Mesa, and ended at a small mark shaped like a five-pointed star. Beside the star, in pencil in the surveyor's hand, the Cliff House. Truth is here. Patience finds it. Marlowe drew in her breath. Winifred closed the journal slowly with her finger keeping the page. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, Marlowe agreed. That night they slept on the cabin floor, on bedrolls Marlowe had pulled from the Toyota. The fire burned down to coals. Boone slept across the threshold of the door with his amber eyes half open and his white blaze pointed out at the dark. Twice in the night the dog lifted his head. Once because a coyote yipped in the draw to the south. Once because a vehicle far off slowed on the county road and then drove on without stopping. Winifred did not sleep. She watched the fire and she thought for some time about the kind of man who carries the wrong thing home from Trinidad in 1962 and pays for it with his life. She thought for some time about the kind of man who buries his brother's name for 40 years and then hides one piece of paper in a Bible because he cannot in the end let the truth die entirely. She thought about her son. In the morning they lifted the hearthstone before they did anything else. It was the third stone in from the left of the firebox. The mortar around it was a slightly paler color than the mortar around the other stones, a careful pale gray that Ezekiel Hartwell the Younger had mixed himself with creek bank clay and ash on the morning of the 17th of September, 1962, because he had known that he was leaving and he had not been certain he was coming back. Marlowe slid a long flat iron, a Toyota lug wrench, under the edge of the stone and lifted. The stone came up. Beneath it was a hollow lined with a folded square of oilcloth. Beneath the oilcloth was a rolled cylinder of unstained deer hide tied with a leather thong. Winifred lifted it out with both hands. She set it on the plank table. She untied the thong. She unrolled the hide. It was a map. It was drawn in charcoal and red berry ink on the pale inner surface of the hide with the patient precision of a man who had decided that the most important piece of paper he would ever make should be drawn on a piece of leather because leather lasts longer than paper. The map showed Section 14 and the country to the north of it. It showed the second cabin under the rim of Black Mesa with a careful drawing of its tin roof and its stone foundation. It showed a trail from the second cabin into a draw of red sandstone climbing into the foothills, and it showed at the end of that trail in a niche carved into the cliff face of Black Mesa itself, the small inked drawing of something that did not look like a cabin at all. It looked like a tower, a stone tower built into a wall of red rock, 3 stories tall, with a watchtower at the corner, with a copper pipe drawn coming out of the top, and a faint pencil notation beside it, steam hot spring visible from West Ridge at sunrise. Marlowe whispered, "Grandma, what is that?" "I do not know, sweetheart. It can't be a cabin. It is whatever your great-uncle Ezekiel built it to be. Beside the drawing in red ink was a single line of script. If you find this, burn the journal. Take the map. Tell no Croft. Winifred touched the line with one fingertip. He knew, she said. He knew the morning he laid the stone that he was going to be killed. And he was telling us 62 years later exactly what to do. She did not burn the journal. She folded the deerhide map and placed it in the canvas bag at her side. She placed the journal and Esther's letter and the photograph back into the walnut box. She closed the box. She set it under her bedroll for the morning. They left the first cabin at sunrise. Boone walked between them. They drove the Toyota as far as the section line would take them, and then they walked. The map led them 8 miles north and west across short grass prairie and across one barbed wire fence Marlowe held open while her grandmother stepped through it and into the broken country at the foot of Black Mesa. The mesa rose up out of the plain like a flat-topped table of red stone. There were no trees on it. There were only the wind and the sky and the long horizontal layers of rust-colored rock that the wind had been carving since the Pliocene. They found the second cabin in the early afternoon in the bottom of a draw exactly where the map said it would be. Stone foundation, log walls, tin roof, a single oak door. The door was open. It had been forced. The padlock that had held it shut for 62 years lay on the porch boards in 2 pieces cut cleanly through with a bolt cutter. Marlowe drew in her breath. Boone's hackles came up in a low ridge from his shoulder blades to the base of his tail. He did not growl. He stood between Winifred and the door with his right ear V-notched, and alert turned toward the inside of the cabin. Winifred put her hand on the dog's head. She stepped past him. She walked into the cabin. It had been searched. The drawers of a small writing desk by the window had been pulled out and dumped on the floor. The mattress on the iron frame bed had been slit lengthwise with a knife, and the horsehair stuffing was scattered. The hearthstone in the small fireplace had been pried up and dropped to the side, broken in 2 pieces. Whoever had come had been looking. Whoever had come had known what to look for, more or less, but had not known where Ezekiel Hartwell the younger had actually hidden it. Boone walked past her slowly with his nose to the floor. He stopped beside the bed. He sat down. He looked up at her. Marlowe knelt beside him. She ran her hand along the floorboards under the iron frame. One of them moved. She pried it up. In the cavity beneath the board lay a second oilcloth bundle, wrapped tight and tied with hemp twine. She lifted it out. She set it on the broken table. She untied it. Inside was a stack of original field notes in a different hand from Ezekiel Hartwell's, a sharper, angrier hand written in iron gall ink that had not faded in 161 years. They were signed at the bottom of the last page by Deputy Surveyor T. McNair, Trinidad, Colorado Territory, June 14, 1863. The notes laid out in plain professional language the actual coordinates of the border between 2 land grants coordinates that did not match the boundary that had been filed with the General Land Office and that placed a tract of 4,800 acres of Black Mesa country, including the mineral rights below it, on the Hartwell side of a line that the Croft family had been operating under paying taxes on and grazing cattle on since 1863. The notes had been initialed in the margin by a second hand, a modern hand, in pencil. The initials were E.H., and the date was September 14, 1962, Trinidad C.O. Marlowe sat back on her heels. He went to Trinidad, she said. He found the original field notes. He brought them home, and he was killed 3 days later. Yes, Grandma. Yes, baby. The land is yours, 4,800 acres, above and below the surface. It has been yours by law since 1863. Winifred looked down at the deer hide map in her hand. She looked at the inked drawing of the tower at the end of the trail. Then we are going to the Cliff House, she said. They did not go that afternoon. They went back to the first cabin instead because the storm came in over the mesa at 3 o'clock in long, flat, purple-gray layers that Marlowe, who had grown up watching the western horizon out of a kitchen window in Tulsa, recognized as the front edge of something the National Weather Service was going to give a name to within the hour. She bundled her grandmother and the dog into the Toyota, and they made it back to the first cabin 20 minutes before the first sleet hit the tin roof. The man came at 4:30. He came in a black Ford F-250 with a Texas license plate, driving slow with the headlights on against the falling sleet. He parked 20 feet short of the porch. He got out. He was a big man in a wool blazer over a flannel shirt with a clean-shaven jaw and silver hair cut very short, and he walked up onto the porch with the relaxed confidence of a man who had been on a great many porches in his life and had never once been refused entry. He knocked. Boone stood at the door with his teeth not showing, but his shoulders raised in the low ridge. Again, his white blaze muzzle pointed at the man's boots through the gap at the bottom of the door. Marlowe opened the door 6 inches. Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Thatcher Croft. I'm with Mesa Land Holdings out of Amarillo. I understand a lady by the name of Hartwell took possession of this parcel earlier in the week, and I was hoping to have a word with her. Winifred stood up from the fire. She walked to the door. She opened it the rest of the way. She did not invite him in. I am Winifred Hartwell. Ma'am, it is a pleasure. He extended a card across the threshold. She did not take it. He set it on the porch rail. I'll be brief. My family has held land adjoining this section for 4 generations. We have a long-standing interest in the parcel you've acquired, and I am authorized to offer you $50,000 cash for a quit-claim deed back to Mesa Land Holdings with closing inside of 7 days. I have the paperwork in the truck. Winifred looked at him. She did not blink. Mr. Croft? Ma'am. Was your grandfather Cyrus Croft? A small professional pause. Yes, ma'am, he was. And your great-grandfather, then, would have been the Mr. Croft who lived in Boise City in 1863. That is correct, ma'am. He came up from Tennessee with the first wave of grazing leases. Mr. Croft, why would a stranger offer $50,000 for a cabin worth 10? Thatcher Croft smiled the small smile of a man who had been asked this question before by other people, and who had not before this moment ever once been asked it by a 76-year-old woman in a wool barn coat with a tawny brown dog at her left boot. Sentimental value, ma'am. My family has always regretted that this corner was outside our holdings. I see. So what do you say, Mrs. Hartwell? $50,000, cash, 7 days. You walk away from a sleet storm with the equivalent of 3 years of Social Security in your pocket. Mr. Croft? Ma'am, I am not selling. He held the smile. Take a night to think about it. I do not need a night. Mrs. Hartwell, forgive me, but I do not think you fully understand what you have or what it would take to keep it. Mr. Croft, forgive me, but I think I understand it considerably better than you do. She closed the door. She locked the door. She stood on the inside of it with her hand on the latch, and Boone stood beside her, and Marlowe stood at her shoulder, and outside in the sleet. The Ford F-250 idled on the gravel for 40 seconds before its driver got back in, turned around, and drove off into the storm. The storm got worse through the night. By midnight, the sleet had turned to snow, and the snow was coming sideways out of the northwest, and the wind had risen to a steady moan in the chimney that made the fire shudder and the dog's ears prick up at intervals. The temperature dropped from 28 degrees to 19 to 12. Marlowe banked the fire as best she could. Winifred sat by the fire with her father's Bible across her lap and her great-grandmother's gold ring against her chest, and she thought about a man named Thatcher Croft and the smooth way his hand had set a business card on the porch rail. It was Boone who lifted his head first. It was a few minutes past 1 in the morning. The dog rose from his place at Winifred's feet and walked on careful feet to the cabin door. He stood there with his right ear cocked and the white blaze on his muzzle pointed at the bottom of the door, and he did not bark and he did not growl, and that was somehow worse than barking or growling would have been. Marlowe stood up. She took the flashlight off the table. She opened the door 3 inches. The snow was coming sideways across the porch at the angle of a flag in a gale. Beyond the porch, in the white sweep of the wind, something was moving very slowly across the open ground from the direction of the section road. A dark shape, stumbling, falling, getting up again. Marlowe said, "Grandma, there's somebody out there." Winifred said, "Go get him." They went out together with 2 blankets and a length of rope. The wind nearly took the flashlight out of Marlowe's hand twice. They reached the dark shape 40 yards short of the porch. It was a man, a thin man in a denim jacket that was not the right coat for this weather. His face under a thin trickle of frozen blood from a cut over one eyebrow, his lips the color of slate. He had put his own truck in a ditch about a mile back on the county road, where he had been sitting since dark, watching the cabin lights through a pair of binoculars. And when the storm turned bad, he had left the truck and tried to walk out to the state highway. He had turned the wrong way in the whiteout. They got him into the cabin. They got him out of the wet jacket. They wrapped him in both blankets and sat him on the stool by the fire with Boone's body across his feet, because the dog, having tracked the temperature of the man's blood the moment he came through the door, had decided of his own accord that this was where he needed to be. The man was not at first lucid. He muttered with his eyes mostly closed things that did not make sense. He muttered, "Branson promised 500 up front and 500 when I called from the highway." He muttered, "I told him I would not hurt the old woman." He muttered, "I just had to slow her down." Marlowe looked at her grandmother across the fire. Her grandmother did not look back. Her grandmother was looking at the man on the stool with the same flat, steady attention she had given the brass deadbolt above her own front door on a Sunday morning 6 weeks before. Then Winifred said very quietly to the half-conscious man, "What is your name?" "Elias Vance." "Where did you come from, Mr. Vance?" "Amarillo. Mr. Croft hired me, Thatcher Croft. But the man who called me first was the woman's son, Hartwell, from Dallas. He gave me a number to call when I had her location. I called. They sent me out here yesterday. I followed you back from the second cabin. I was supposed to wait until you came out and then move you off the road. With the truck, just bump you, just enough to keep you off the property another week, so they could finish their filing." Marlowe said very softly, "What filing?" "The mineral lease, ma'am. The Continental Resources mineral lease. They have been trying to file it for 10 days. They cannot file it until they hold the surface rights. They thought they held the surface rights through your grandmother's son. But your grandmother's son does not have the surface rights to the Cimarron parcel, because she bought it 3 days ago in her own name." Winifred sat very still. "Mr. Vance, why does Continental Resources care about a quarter section of grass in Cimarron County?" Elias Vance lifted his head with what looked like considerable effort. He looked at her with eyes the color of clean ash. "Because there's oil under it, ma'am. Shallow oil. 1,800 feet. The lease covers this section and the 4 around it. 4,800 acres. They've been quietly surveying it for 2 years out of a field office in Guyman. Your son found out from a college friend at Continental in July. He has been trying since August to get title in his name so he could turn around and sign the lease and collect the bonus and the royalty." "How much?" "The signing bonus is $1.2 million, ma'am. The royalty over the life of the lease on Continental's projections is between 4 and 7 million. Marlowe sat down on the floor. She put her face in her hands. Winifred Hartwell, who had owned 2 crumpled dollar bills in a wool coat and a wedding ring on a chain 6 weeks before, did not move. She looked at the fire. She said after some seconds, "Mr. Vance, I want you to sleep. I want you to drink the broth my granddaughter is going to make. And I want you in the morning to write down everything you have just told me and to sign it and to come with us to the courthouse in Boise City." "Yes, ma'am." "And Mr. Vance, ma'am, thank you for not driving into my granddaughter." He closed his eyes. The dog Boone, who had not moved from the man's feet, settled his chin across the man's boot and stayed there until morning. The storm broke at sunrise. They did not go to the Cliff House that day or the next. Other things had become more urgent. They went instead with Elias Vance in the back of the Toyota and his signed handwritten statement folded in Marlowe's coat pocket to Mabel Ainsworth's office in the Cimarron County Courthouse. Mabel Ainsworth made 3 phone calls, one to the Cimarron County Sheriff, one to the Oklahoma Attorney General's office in Oklahoma City, and one to a retired judge named Henry Whitaker in Beaver County, who had been her late great-aunt Esther's pastor for 31 years, and who agreed without hesitation to come down to Boise City the following morning. Branson Hartwell arrived in Boise City that same afternoon in a rented sedan with Camille in the passenger seat and a lawyer from Oklahoma City in the back. He came to the courthouse. He came up the steps in his good gray suit with his face arranged the way Winifred had seen it arranged on the porch in Tulsa in early September, with the smile he had used as a child when he wanted something he could not have, and with Camille's hand on his elbow, and with the lawyer behind him holding a folder. Winifred was waiting for him in Mabel Ainsworth's office in her olive wool barn coat in the chair beside Mabel's desk. Marlowe was standing behind her chair. Boone was at her left boot. Judge Henry Whitaker, in a clean black suit, was sitting at the small conference table by the window with a yellow legal pad open in front of him. Elias Vance's signed statement was on the legal pad. Beside Elias Vance's statement was the deed Mabel Ainsworth had issued 3 days before. Beside the deed was the McNair field notes packet from the second cabin. Beside the McNair packet was the small leather journal of Ezekiel Hartwell the Younger. Beside the journal was the photograph of Esther and Ezekiel taken in April of 1962 in front of a cabin that now belonged to Winifred Hartwell. Branson came into the room. He stopped when he saw what was on the table. His face did not change in any of the large ways. It changed in the small ways. The small ways were the ones Winifred had been watching for since the morning of his birth. He said, "Mom." Winifred said, "Sit down, Branson." He did not sit. Camille stepped forward to speak. Winifred said without turning her head, "Camille, you will not speak in this room." Camille did not speak. Branson said, "Mom, whatever you have been told." Branson, "Yes, I have been told what you did, and I have been shown what you did, and I am not going to ask you to explain it because there is no version of it that becomes anything other than what it is." "Mom, I forgave you," she said on the porch in Tulsa. "I forgave you the moment I tried the key in my own front door and understood what had been done. I have had 6 weeks now to sit with it, and I forgive you again this morning. But Branson, forgiveness is not the same as trust, and it is not the same as the law." She nodded very slightly to Marlowe. Marlowe stepped forward. She slid across the table to her father 3 sets of papers. The first was a civil filing in the District Court of Tulsa County for the rescission of a fraudulent power of attorney and the restoration of full title to the Tulsa property to Winifred Hartwell. The second was a quiet title action in the District Court of Cimarron County, asserting the Hartwell family's interest in 4,800 acres of surface and mineral rights under the original 1863 survey, corrected per the McNair field notes. The third was a criminal referral to the Oklahoma Attorney General's office for forgery fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud against Branson Hartwell, Camille Hartwell, and Thatcher Croft. Branson looked at the 3 sets of papers. He looked at his daughter. He looked at his mother. He did not speak for some seconds. Then he said, "Mom, please." Winifred said, "Go home, Branson." He stood there for a moment longer. Camille took his elbow. They left the room. That afternoon, Thatcher Croft was served at his ranch outside Amarillo by a Cimarron County Sheriff's deputy. He turned himself in the following morning. The criminal investigation into the disappearance of Ezekiel Hartwell the Younger in 1962 was reopened by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation within 30 days. McNair's 1863 field notes were certified by the state surveyor's office within 90. The quiet title action was uncontested by every adjoining landowner except Mesa Land Holdings, and Mesa Land Holdings, in the wake of Thatcher Croft's indictment, withdrew its objection in March. The Continental Resources mineral lease was signed in late April. It was signed by Winifred Hartwell. The signing bonus after attorney's fees came to $940,000. Winifred set aside $200,000 of it for Marlowe's law school and the down payment on whatever small house in Tulsa Marlowe wanted to put it on. She set aside another $200,000 in an irrevocable trust for any of Branson's future children other than Marlowe to be administered by Mabel Ainsworth. She set aside $100,000 for the small Methodist church in Boise City. The rest she kept against the cost of restoring 3 structures on Hartwell land that had not been kept up in 62 years. What is the difference between forgiveness and weakness? The difference is the second set of papers. The difference is the quiet title action. The difference is that you do not, having been wronged, hand the wrongdoer the keys to do it again. You forgive him in your heart for the sake of your own soul. You hold him accountable in the world for the sake of every other soul that the world contains. The Methodist hymnal Winifred had been carrying to church on the morning of the locks had not in fact asked anything else of her. She had simply for some years been reading the easier half of it. But this is not yet the end. It is 1 week into May. The sleet of November is long gone. The short-grass prairie of Cimarron County has turned in the way it does in May the color of new green velvet. The cottonwood at the corner of the first cabin has come into leaf 2 days before the ones in town, the way the cottonwoods on the Tulsa farm always did. Marlowe Hartwell has come out for the weekend from her last week of final exams. Winifred Hartwell is sitting on the porch of the first cabin in a clean blue dress and her olive wool barn coat with the sleeves pushed up, drinking coffee out of a tin cup. Boone is lying across her left boot. She has over the last 6 months been to the Cliff House 19 times. She walked to it the first time with Marlowe and Boone and Jasper Wexler, the 87-year-old Korean War veteran from Sundown Road, who had known her father in 1955. They had followed the deer-hide map north and west out of the second cabin into a draw of red sandstone, climbing into the foothills of Black Mesa for 2 hours, and they had come at last around a shoulder of rock to a view that none of them had been prepared for. The Cliff House was built directly into the face of the mesa. It was 3 stories tall. Its foundation was the ruined stone footing of a frontier outpost from the 1830s, which Ezekiel Hartwell the Younger had discovered in 1948 and had spent 20 years not so much building on as completing, adding 2 stories of hand-fitted cedar above the original stone with mortise and tenon joinery that used no nails. At the northwest corner, he had built into the face of the cliff itself a stone watchtower 30 feet tall with a single round window at the top that faced west toward the setting sun. From a copper pipe near the roof, steam from a natural hot spring inside the rock rose in a slow, continuous column into the cold air, where it caught the morning light and made the whole structure look from a distance as though somebody had lit a fire inside that morning and walked away. The first time Winifred Hartwell saw the Cliff House from the shoulder of rock at the edge of the draw, she put her hand to her mouth. Marlowe said, "Grandma." Winifred said, "He built that. He built that by himself." Jasper Wexler said, "Mrs. Hartwell, your uncle was a great craftsman of the kind this country does not produce anymore. He was working on this when I was a young man. I used to see him in town for nails and copper tube and tar paper. He never told anyone what it was. He said it was a hunting camp. It is not a hunting camp. No, ma'am, it is not." Inside the Cliff House, they had found Ezekiel Hartwell the Younger's actual life. Bookshelves of poetry and geology and Methodist sermons, a workbench of surveying instruments laid out in the order he had used them, a bed with a single folded wool blanket as if he were going to come back to it, a pine plank table with a leather-bound ledger 3 inches thick at the center of it, in which Ezekiel Hartwell the Younger had recorded in the careful slanted hand of a man with no audience 20 years of original surveys of the Oklahoma Panhandle, including water tables and mineral veins, and the locations of 17 previously unrecorded prehistoric petroglyphs in the canyon country of Black Mesa, which would later be donated by Winifred Hartwell to the University of Oklahoma, and would constitute by every serious estimate the most important amateur survey of the Western Plains conducted in the 20th century. In a tin box on the workbench, they had found a doeskin pouch of placer gold panned out of 3 creeks running off the south face of the mesa over a period of 20 years, weighing 4 pounds, 9 ounces. In an envelope under the ledger, they had found one more letter. To the Hartwell who has the patience to come home. The land does not belong to me, and it will not belong to you. We belong to it. We are passing through. The deeds in Boise City say one thing. The dust says another. The dust is older. The dust is right. I leave you my work in the gold, because a person ought not to have to begin a hard work without a stake. But the work is the gift, not the gold. The work is the map. Do not let the greedy ones have any of it. Yours, Ezekiel Hartwell. October 1962. Sacred theme. The land remembers what the deeds forget. Winifred had been reading the ledger page by page for 6 months. She had begun to make notes in the margins in her own hand, the careful round W of a third-grade copybook from 1956. She had begun to add to what her great-uncle had begun. She was by May drawing the surface springs of her own quarter section on a sheet of butcher paper tacked to the wall of the first cabin. This morning, the first cabin porch in May. A red-tailed hawk calls once from the cottonwood at the corner of the drive. Boone lifts his head. The white blaze on his muzzle catches the morning light. The small V notch in his right ear turns toward the sound. Marlowe comes out the cabin door with a second tin cup of coffee. She sits down on the porch step beside her grandmother. Grandma. Yes, baby. Jasper called this morning. He's bringing the planks for the porch railing tomorrow. All right. And Mabel said the title work on the upper 40 came through. All right. They drink their coffee. After a few minutes, Marlowe says, Grandma. Yes. I found something in the cliff house yesterday afternoon, in the wall, behind the chimney in the watchtower. A loose stone. I almost did not see it. Boone was the one who showed me. He sat in front of it for half an hour. Winifred set her cup down on the porch board. What did you find? Marlowe reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. She took out a small leather pouch. She handed it to her grandmother. Winifred opened the pouch. Inside was a single photograph. It was a black and white photograph taken with a Brownie camera in good summer sunlight in front of the cliff house sometime in the middle 1950s. The watchtower was already finished. The cedar walls of the upper floors had not yet weathered to the color they would later become. On the porch of the cliff house in the foreground stood a thin man in a brown work coat with his hand on the shoulder of a girl of about 7 years old. The girl was wearing a yellow dress with a white collar that her mother had sewn for her that spring. She was wearing 2 thin braids that her mother had braided that morning. She was looking up at the man with the very steady, faded blue Hartwell eyes she had been born with. On the back of the photograph in pencil, in the careful slanted hand of a surveyor, Winifred, the girl with the quiet eyes. She'll come back someday. They always do. Winifred sat for a long time without speaking. Boone laid his white blazed muzzle across her boot. The wind moved the new leaves of the cottonwood at the corner of the drive. After some minutes, she said very softly, My father drove me out here in 1955. I had forgotten. I had completely forgotten. I remembered a smell, pine and tobacco. I remembered being lifted up onto a porch. I did not remember the porch. I did not remember the man. I did not know until this moment that the man was my great-uncle Ezekiel, and that this house was a house I had stood on the porch of when I was 7 years old. Marlowe put her hand on her grandmother's hand. He knew you would come back. He hoped. He knew Grandma. Winifred turned the photograph over in her hand. She looked at the 7-year-old girl on the porch of the cliff house. She looked at her great-uncle Ezekiel, whose face she had been trying to remember for 6 months, and who looked in the photograph very much the way her father had looked when her father had been a young man. She thought about the dust. She thought about the deed. She thought about a Sunday morning in October when she had tried a key in her own front door and the cylinder had not turned. She said, that is the thing about land. Land does not stop being a family's just because the deeds change hands. The dust remembers the boots that broke it. The wind remembers the names called across the fields at supper time. The cottonwood at the corner of the drive remembers the man who planted it. The hearthstone remembers the morning it was laid, and the mortar mixed with creek bank clay and ash by hands that knew even then that they might not come back. Paper forgets. The land does not forget. The Cimarron homestead had waited 62 years for Winifred Hartwell without knowing her name. It had waited through 11 seasons of dust and 3 of flood. It had waited through a war and a moon landing and the small private griefs of every family in Boise City. It had waited through the death of a postmistress named Esther Ainsworth, who had folded a letter into a wooden box in March of 2020 and had asked her great niece to give it to a Hartwell when a Hartwell came home. It had waited through the death of Frederick Hartwell, who had hidden a piece of paper in a Bible in 1985 and had never been brave enough to take it out again. It had waited through the long quiet of a marriage and the long quiet of a widowhood and the long quiet of a Sunday morning on a porch swing in Tulsa County while a brass wind chime turned in the breeze with no one left on the porch to hear it. And in the end, it had not waited in vain. Winifred Hartwell was 76 years old. She was locked out of the only house she had ever known. She had $2 to her name and a dog who had walked out of the grass beside a mailbox in Tulsa County for reasons of his own, and a granddaughter who had given up her bed without saying so, and the gold wedding ring of a great-grandmother she had never met against her chest. She spent the $2 on a cabin no one had laid eyes on in 62 years. It was the best $2 she ever spent. The land remembers what the deeds forget, and it remembered her.